Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lesson on the American Constitution and the start of the government of the United States. We're coming off of the Revolution lesson. Today we have some notes and slides on the Constitution. If you're in person with me, we'll do a mock constitutional convention and have an exit ticket about constitutional amendments. I want us to have in mind our overarching theme of enduring issues. What enduring issues does the Constitution address is a question that we should be able to answer by the end of class. I also like us to have in mind our exit ticket, which is about amendments. So does anybody know what a constitutional amendment is? Is something I would ask you if you were in person. We're going to talk about it throughout the lesson. A constitutional amendment is a change to the Constitution. So first we need to know about the first version of government before the United States moved to the current Constitution, and that was called the Articles of Confederation. There was not very much federal leadership under this. States had a very loose union, with each state having a much larger role than any federal government did. The Constitution was established after the Articles were proven weak, and this is when they set up the executive, legislative, and judicial branches officially. And they had to make a lot of compromises due to regional differences. So the Constitution is a document that lays out the laws and principles of a government. Other countries might call their founding documents a constitution as well, so it's not unique to the United States. When the colonies became individual states, the states each drafted a state constitution, and nearly every state still has a state constitution. The Articles of Confederation was set up by Congress to attempt to form a national government. This was like the first constitution of the United States, and these drew very closely from Enlightenment ideas. The new nation is going to have to face a lot of conflicts. One of these we just mentioned is going to be regional differences. So we'll get into what some of those regional differences are and how they solve them. Following the American Revolution, a lot of states realized that they need a national government. So they approved the Articles of Confederation in 1777. This was a friendship or a loose alliance of the states. And Congress was made up of one representative from each state. They didn't have very many powers. What they could do was declare war and make peace, borrow money and set standards for coins, and establish a postal service. So this leaves them with a lot of weaknesses, such as states have a lot more power than the central government, and the central government could not impose taxes. So without the ability to impose taxes, they'll have to get really creative with their fundraising, which we'll see in just a few slides. Again, the AOC, or Articles of Confederation, was more of a league of friendship. And they had this one house legislation known as the Confederation Congress. This was the only governmental body with control over an army and the authority to deal with foreign countries on behalf of the states. The colonists refused to give up power to the Confederation in fear of a powerful central government. They're really afraid of this coming out of rulership from the king. In order for any law to be passed in Congress, 9 of the 13 state representatives had to agree. So there are a lot of differences among the states. This makes it really challenging to agree. For example, we have slavery prominent in the South and not so much reliant on in the North. Here we have some weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, including lack of power and money, lack of central power, and too rigid of rules. Congress doesn't have power to collect taxes, regulate trade, or enforce its laws. There's no single leaders. There's no president under the Articles. There's no national court systems. There's no Supreme Court. And Congress needs approval of 9 of the 13 states to pass any laws. The articles in general could not be changed without agreement of all 13 states. So if they want to make an amendment, it has to be passed by all 13 states. So let's go into some of the accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation. So it wasn't a complete failure. We've got some good things coming out of it. Both of these are going to be IDs if you're in my class with me. We've got the Ordinance of 1785. This divided land into townships and allowed Congress to raise money by selling land to settlers. So this helped to, as we mentioned, raise funds, even though the federal government could not tax. And then we have the Northwest Ordinance. This laid the basis for the organization of new territorial governments and set a precedent for the method of admitting new states to the Union. So they admitted Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which I have a picture of that region up here. Of course, this will negatively impact the Native American people and force them to move even further west. So next we're going to talk about Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was a veteran of the War from Independence, and Massachusetts was threatening to take his farm back over taxes. So this led to a huge pushback, protests, rebellion that showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and made the new government, or made the leaders of the Confederation fearful and want to create some more power available. What was the primary cause of Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787? Take a moment to pause and make a guess if you would like to practice this question at home. And if you are in person with me, I'll have played a video on this, so you'll have a little bit more background as well. Your answer should be C. High levels of debt and economic hardship among farmers is one of the main causes of Shays' Rebellion. So after Shays' Rebellion, people realize that they need a bit of a change, and they gather at this constitutional convention. Originally, the people wanted to just revise the Articles of Confederation, but they decided they needed an entirely new constitution. They wanted to make the national government stronger by giving it the power to collect taxes and regulate trade. The delegates of the constitutional conventions, that's the people who are sent here, have to decide what they want to do for Congress, the president, and the courts. So this comes with the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch that they will form. Hopefully you have a little bit of background knowledge on these three branches from civics class, but we'll talk about them a little bit more. The legislative branch consists of Congress. They make the laws, approve presidential appointments. There are 2 senators from each state, and the number of House of Representatives members varies based on the population. The executive branch signs laws, vetoes laws, pardons people, appoints federal judges, and is elected every 4 years. That's the president and his cabinet, are part of this branch. And we've got the judicial branch. They decide if laws are unconstitutional or constitutional. They're appointed by the president, and the Supreme Court consists of 9 justices that can overturn rulings by other lower court judges. So these 3 branches of the U.S. Constitution make up the majority of the federal government, or everyone who's part of the federal government can fit into one of these 3 categories. Whether it's supporting the 100 senators or the 435 representatives members, the president, vice president, or their cabinet, the Supreme Court, and other federal courts are part of the U.S. Constitution. So if you're in person with me, I'm going to go over some directions for an activity. I'm going to assign you a state to represent at the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to give you a little paper that has some information about your state's ideas, concerns, and priorities. And based on the conflicts in your state, you are going to talk to your table about how your state would answer these questions. These are some things that they're debating at the Constitutional Convention. How should they determine representation in the legislature? Should it be based on population? Should it be equal for all states, or a combination of both? How much power should the federal government have compared to states? What areas of government should be under federal control, and what should be left to the states? How difficult should it be to amend the Constitution? Should it require a simple majority, a supermajority, or unanimity among the states? Should a Bill of Rights be included in the Constitution to protect individual freedoms? What rights should we list? How should the issue of slavery be addressed in the new Constitution? Should enslaved people be counted for representation, taxes, or both? So we'll have a little discussion in class about this. I'll add a debate slide here. And after we have a chance to discuss and you've argued for your state, I'm going to abandon your state's perspective and argue just what you think about those 5 questions. How should we set up the Constitution? This is your reflection. It's just going to be a 1-paragraph answer to these 5 questions, and then you'll submit it and it'll be a prepared grade if you're in person in class with me. Next, we have the Great Compromise. This has to do with the biggest disagreement which was over how many votes each state should have in Congress. So we have the idea that bigger states should have more representation because they have a larger population. This proposal is called the Virginia Plan, or that smaller states think that each state should have equal votes. This is called the New Jersey Plan. So let's make a guess what you think. It's going to be a compromise between the two, the Great Compromise. It's called the Great Connecticut Compromise, and the legislature is going to have two houses. The Senate is going to be equal for all states with 2 members, and the House of Representatives will be determined by the state's population. So here we see from the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan comes the Great Compromise. Next, we have the 3/5 compromise, which is less celebrated in American history because the result of this compromise came to say that enslaved people would be counted for population as 3/5 of a person. So Southern states wanted enslaved people to be counted towards representation, but not taxation. Northern states wanted them to be counted for taxation, but not for representation. And what they came up with to resolve this issue was the 3/5 compromise. Therefore, the people would be counted as 3/5 of a person towards both taxation and representation. This obviously impacts society and culture by establishing that in the US Constitution, enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person, which is very sad. Here I have a practice multiple choice question for us. I'm on Zoom, so my question is a little bit cut off for me, but we've got something like, what was the compromise during the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in the United States? So you should have to determine the representation of each state in the House of Representatives. So here we have some comparisons between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. The Constitution is a lot stronger. It has a lot more powers. The executive branch forms, the judicial branch forms. So under the Articles, there was only Congress. There was only the legislative branch. Now, to ratify the Constitution, they need approval of 9 of the 13 states. The Federalists support the Constitution, and they write the Federalist Papers to defend it. The Anti-Federalists oppose the Constitution. They fear that it would give the central government too much power and not protect people's rights. So the Federalists are writing to defend the Constitution. They did ultimately agree to this Bill of Rights to be added that the Anti-Federalists wanted in order to get to this compromise where, with the Bill of Rights, enough states ratified the Constitution. North Carolina was one of the last states to approve of the Constitution, and George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. He takes office in New York City, which was the capital at the time. And then we have the Bill of Rights added, of course, as mentioned. So this Bill of Rights helps to protect the citizens' personal rights. It becomes part of the constitutional amendments and protects things like freedom of speech, religion, and of the press. So there are 10 main amendments in here. The first I just mentioned, the second being the right to bear arms, the third preventing forced housing of soldiers during times of war, the fourth protecting against unreasonable search. Then we've got rights in criminal cases, rights to a fair trial, rights in civil cases, rights against cruel and unusual punishments, rights retained by the people, and powers retained by the states and the people. So they want, with that 10th one, of course, for the states to have some reserved rights so that the federal government doesn't have a right over everything, and saying if the Constitution does not specifically state that a right is a federal power, it should be a state right. So these amendments are often still referenced today. For example, we have things like Miranda rights referenced back to the amendments. Freedom of speech is referenced all the time. So let's talk a little bit about checks and balances. So each of the 3 branches of government has a check on the other 2 branches to ensure that none of the branches has unreasonable amounts of control. For example, federal judges are nominated by the president and have to be approved by Congress. Another example is that bills have to be passed by both houses of the legislative branch, Senate and House of Representatives, signed by the president, and can be challenged in courts. So we see representation of checks and balances still in current events as well. So if you're in my class, the IDs that you should be able to complete for today are Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Land Ordinance of 1785, Federalists, and Anti-Federalists. So we'll have some time to finish those up. And then we'll have some presentations on Phyllis Wheatley, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, and Deborah Reed Franklin. So you'll have an opportunity to fill in some notes on these presentations. And then for our exit ticket for today, going to have an opportunity to propose a constitutional amendment. How would you raise support for your amendment? Who might oppose your amendment? And I'll have a poster for you to stick your suggestion onto. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I hope that you learned a lot about the US Constitution.